collective society, we're consuming too much too fast. And so that's where Canopy actually, that's where our model of change kind of really digs in, and we focus our attention. So this is basically our model of change. So we're an ambitious organization, but we'd like to think that we're not a completely crazy organization. Behavioral change is a very difficult thing to achieve. Hands up anybody who has a partner or a kid who has, you know, resisted your best efforts to change their behavior. Yes, behavioral change is a very difficult thing for us to achieve. There are currently 7 billion people in the world, and by 2050 there will be 9 billion people. Us as an environmental organization embarking to try and change the behaviors of 9 billion people is mission impossible. But what we can do is engage here at this level of kind of like senior corporate decision makers that work within companies that buy a lot of paper or a lot of rayon. And so our work is really based on the business adage that the customer is always right. And what we've found is that the more money they spend, the more right they are. So we work with 750 of the forest industry's largest corporate customers. And by engaging at this level, we've been able to help those companies source sustainable papers, as Michael's previous professional incarnation in the magazine sector. And what that then helps do is it engages forestry companies and paper mills to develop more environmental products, to stop logging in endangered species habitat. It helps then create a political environment whereby governments actually feel like they want to move forward and actually protect forest ecosystems. And then ultimately what it means is that when Scholastic print their school books on environmental paper, it means that kids are just automatically able to make sustainable choices because it's actually institutionalized. And so we actually achieve behavioral change kind of at a more systemic level. So that's kind of the way that we work. These are some of the brands that we work with, primarily in the book, magazine, newspaper, commercial print, and then more recently, the clothing sector. We're probably best known for bringing the Harry Grant to fashion. About 5 years ago, our team were looking at new emerging threats to forest ecosystems around the world, and we discovered that rayon production, or viscose family of fabrics, was actually a very fast emerging threat to forest ecosystems, which, to be honest, took us by surprise. So 5 years ago, there were 70 million trees that disappeared into clothing every year. That number is now 120 million, so it's grown quite quickly in that period of time. It's slated to more than double again within the next decade. So it's a very aggressively growing pressure to forest ecosystems. And so that's what caught our attention at Canopy, was the potential to actually try and proactively redirect the supply chain before it got too entrenched. And the link, I think there are a lot of people who are surprised that there's a link between forest and fashion. Trees are, trees give you splinters. Clothing is generally something soft and silky next to the skin. But what happens, the supply chain link is basically trees are logged in a forest ecosystem. They're sent to a dissolving pulp mill where they are basically put in a giant blender with a whole lot of very intense chemicals. Out of that comes dissolving pulp, which is then sent to the viscose mill. It's then mixed with a whole series of other chemicals, shot through a fiber head, and you end up with this filament, the viscose filament, which is essentially, kind of feels like cotton. And then it's sent to spinners, weavers, garment makers, cutters, and then eventually it ends up in the boutiques and malls that we all buy from. And as I mentioned, one of the things that really captured our attention was, as environmental activists, we're so often, and in society, we're so often chasing the train that's already left the station. Like, the tracks are already laid, those tracks head straight out over a chasm, and they don't have tracks that sort of continue over the other side of the chasm, and the train's partly down the track. And what we felt was, with this initiative, 120 million trees disappearing into clothing every year is not a small number. But we have the potential to engage now and redirect direct that supply chain before it gets really entrenched with billions of dollars worth of mill infrastructure being built in the wrong places, right next to endangered forest ecosystems. So we've really seen this as the potential for us to build a fence at the top of the cliff rather than the usual scenario where we're kind of building a hospital at the bottom. And so we've been incredibly excited with the momentum and the receptivity that there's been with the fashion industry. We've been fortunate to have other designers join Nick, along with our initial sort of larger brands for the campaign launch of Canopy Style back just 2.5 years ago. So Eileen Fisher, Lululemon, Patagonia, Prana, and Quicksilver were kind of the more mainstream brands to join on, and then we had 20 really progressive designers standing behind us. Gave us incredible early stage momentum, which we were then able to take out to the broader industry. And we now have 60 clothing brands who are on board with the Canopy Style campaigns, formally committed to not sourcing from endangered forest ecosystems. And as you can see, we've got a really fantastic array of the industry. So the big fast fashion companies that have a lot of volume, like H&M and Zara, global icons like Levi's, and then the more kind of like progressive, sustainable designers like Stella McCartney, Fisher, and everybody else in between. So it's been a very kind of like, we've gone basically from 0 to 120 in sort of like a 2.5 year period. We've been very fortunate with the brands that have made commitments. They've actually really sort of engaged with us to engage their suppliers. And it's probably almost as exciting as it looks. The exciting thing from a geeky perspective, so Mr. Tashman a minute ago, the exciting thing about the fashion industry is that with the rayon supply chain, the top 10 producers control about 75% of global production. And so it's an incredibly concentrated supply chain. And so if we can get those 10 producers to just make different sourcing commitments, then that is enough to create a tipping point and transform an unsustainable supply chain. So that's where we're really focused. That's the strategy that we've engaged brands, and brands have really stepped in and joined us in. And we currently have viscose producers that represent about 65% of global production, formally on board with commitments in place, which, given that we only launched this campaign 2.5 years ago, is actually a massive shift. The Canopy Style campaign, I'd say, is actually the fastest moving environmental initiative within the apparel sector. So our biggest ask is to ensure that rayon is not coming from endangered forests. That's kind of the short-term immediate ask. And then kind of the medium to longer term piece is kind of like the work that we did around Harry Potter and our work with publishers, which is to what are the alternatives that designers and brands can shift onto. And Kate just mentioned the stat earlier on, that 150 billion pieces of apparel are produced every year. That's an incredible volume of clothing that's being produced. It sits in our wardrobes, largely unused for a long period of time, and then 85% of that volume of clothing generally ends up in places like this. So one of the solutions pieces that Canopy is really working with brands and producers to really try and kickstart is kind of more of a circular economy approach to fashion and to fabric manufacturing, which is to use recycled fabrics as the next generation of fabrics. Obviously, there are also non-wool alternatives. So straw that's left over as a byproduct of the grain harvest, which we have used on the paper side. We've got a special edition of Jan Martel's book, Life of Pi, here. Also excellent for making fabrics with, and carries half the ecological footprint. So looking at what of those fibers are actually really viable alternatives, and how can we bring them to economy of scale production. And then the last piece for us is drawing all of this supply chain shift and this market interest back to change on the ground in these really special landscapes that are left in the world. And Canopy was very fortunate to be one of a number of organizations that work to protect the Great Bear Rainforest. The Great Bear Rainforest, for those, is everybody aware of the Great Bear Rainforest? Basically, it stretches down from Alaska, 2/3 of the way down the BC coast, and it's got bears and whales and charismatic megafauna or megaflora wherever you look, essentially. Big towering western red cedars. It's a very charismatic landscape. 90% of the Great Bear Rainforest used to be open for logging, and as a result of customer engagement, many hard years of many people's work, many flattened foreheads from people beating their heads against each other's chests and brick walls, 85% of the Great Bear Rainforest is now off limits to logging or formally protected. And so this is kind of the shift from 2005 through to February 2016. The green being good. So more green is sort of like an indication that it's good, for 90% of that area being available for logging to 85% of it basically being off limits and conserved. The Great Bear Rainforest agreements would not have happened without large international customers and Canadian customers, so big consumers of newspaper, like the Globe and Mail here in Toronto, played a really important role. Penguin Random House engaged on numerous occasions, as did many international brands, Kimberly-Clark, Home Depot. They were the reason that companies came to the negotiations table with Canopy and other environmental organizations in the first place, and that was the incentive for the British Columbia government to actually finalize the agreement. That fact that sort of like in a competitive marketplace, this was an area that was important to be seen as taking long-term conservation solutions into account. And so that was just finalized on February 1st, and now we're looking to take what happened in the Great Bear and apply it with a couple of tweaks to other landscapes, namely Indonesia, which has the dubious title of being the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, behind China and the US. And given that it's not a huge industrial nation, it's a disturbing fact, and the vast majority of its greenhouse gas emissions come because its forests they're high carbon forests, they're kind of often growing on peatlands, and those peatlands are drained. So this is a forest that's grown on a peat dome, sometimes up to 20 meters deep, and then they drain the water, and with draining the water, the peat dries out, and then it releases a lot of carbon dioxide and methane, and it's highly combustible. And so oftentimes you'll hear periodically that Malaysia and Singapore are having problems with haze. That's because there are forest fires in Indonesia. And then there's this magical landscape, kind of like the Great Bear Rainforest, but in northern Sumatra called the Losa ecosystem. It's the last place on Earth where there are rhinos, elephants, tigers, and orangutans and sunbears all still co-inhabiting as one space. And so that's a landscape of hope that we feel should be conserved for future generations, and it's a landscape that's under threat from palm oil development and for pulp development for clothing as well as for paper production. And so that's a forest region that Canopy is directly engaging with other international groups as well as local NGOs to help conserve. So that's kind of the galloping horse introduction to Canopy and our work on Canopy style, and just how important the commitments are by brands and by designers, and how that kind of really helps drive change, not only through their supply chain, but to kind of landscapes in special places around the world. Canopy's really focused on how can we magnify our impact. We have a relatively small team. We run fairly lean. There's 11 of us, and we've run to date always on a budget of less than $1 million. So we're working to change some of the world's largest companies with fairly modest resources, both human and financial. But we're very fortunate to have a very kind of smart, dedicated team. Two of my colleagues are here tonight. So Laura Reppes, who's here in our Toronto office, is our communications director, and Fazia Ahmad, our development and operations director. So feel free to grab any of us after this to chat, and we are always looking for ways that we can be smarter and have more impact. So if you have suggestions for us, if you have donations for us, of course, we won't say no, but also if you feel like there are people that we should know, or places that we should be, then let us know. I think I'm going to stop talking. I think Kate is going to chat a little bit. And if folks don't know, Kate Black is magnificent. Magnificent. Which you're selling tonight, maybe with some persons for us?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
And she also runs a really fabulous speaker salon for eco sessions.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you. So we're partnering, this is my first Toronto Eco Sessions, and Eco Sessions is really a platform to connect industry designers and citizens to discuss change. So I can't think of a better reason for us all to get together than to talk about deforestation and the role of fashion. And the reason why it's so perfect for me to stand in the middle between the two is because this book that I wrote, I'm originally a blogger, well not originally, but I've been blogging about ethical fashion since 2008. I started this blog called Magnifico.com as a daily eco-fashion find. And I would write about designers and brands who were doing things differently. And in 2014, I had the chance to write a book. And it started because I looked at the back of somebody's book. I was at a salon in New York and somebody was doing a book reading and I looked at the back and I saw, oh, New Society. I flipped open and I realized, oh, it's a Canadian publisher, FSC paper, soy inks. If I write a book, it needs to be on that. So this kind of started this path of getting me in a conversation with a publisher because through Eco Sessions, all the kind of Q&As and all the things that were coming up that weren't being addressed on the blog, because the blog is very optimistic and really features like the good things that are coming out of this industry and out of fashion and people really working towards change. I didn't say why. And I kind of just assumed that people understood why, but they didn't. So I needed to write an expose about the fashion industry and why this stuff is important. So as I was digging around for why should we be choosing organic cotton instead of conventional cotton, what other problems should we be uncovering, Canopy's name kept coming up. And of course, that's another interesting story. I was sitting in a cafe in New York and somebody said, oh, you're from Toronto, you must know Tara. No, Tara from Canopy. And Tara's not even from Toronto. That was how kind of wrong their geography is. So Canopy was on my radar, and it was really important for me to kind of tell consumers, because to this point about the 150 billion garments, the fashion industry is moving faster than we can even imagine. And they're moving at the speed of light, and we know that it's a race to the bottom. We know every time we go into H&M or Zara that not only are they eroding our domestic production, but they're also just driving the price down. Like how can a company like Mick compete with a $5.99 dress? Like and what is a $5.99 dress made of anyway? Well, I'll tell you what it's made of. Deforestation and trees. Right from H&M.
No.
Okay. Sorry, not you.
We'll walk through an H&M, we're like, it's so cheap, this isn't right.
It's not right. And when you realize that it's actually some of our heritage is going into that, like the boreal forest, and so we need to be involved in this, and we need to kind of take notice of this, and if anybody is going to help shift this, with the help of Canopy, it's the Canadian consumer. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I'm thrilled to be selling the book. So the book is part of a giveaway. So there's this fantastic giveaway that I'm sure Laura will tell you about. But I'm also selling a book. The cover price is $19.95. I'm going to sell it for $15 here and then give $5 for every copy to Canopy for their fundraising effort. So thank you for having me, and Laura.
So we could, you know what we could do now? If anybody else wants to throw their cards in, we could actually, since it's after 7:30, we could draw for the door prize.